let's talk about CSS, how to lay out your sexy web app. Historically speaking, it was a bit complicated to bring a nice layout to your website. Yeah, if you've been doing a bit of CSS in the past, you will remember things like floating elements and things like that. But eventually, it was a big mess. Yeah? Thankfully, the CSS community realized that we needed something new, and that's why the standard recently introduced a couple of very powerful techniques to deal with layouts. So I would like today to talk about, first of all, Flexbox that you may have heard about, and also about grid. So grid is the sexiest thing you can do in CSS. Yeah, I have to say that grid can be very tough, very complicated, but at the same time, that is because it can be very powerful. Yeah, so at least if you want to build something very complicated, very powerful, you have the opportunity using Flex and Grid. And before going into any details, I would like to show you that on the Codery platform, you got a Flexbox, no, two Flexbox training modules. Let me show you. Here you go. You see? You got two Flexbox modules and one grid module. Yeah. So even though I'm not going to solve it now because I want you to struggle a bit with it, let me show you the type of things that we can deal. So if you've never seen the HTML and CSS training, so we present you a device, could be a smartphone, could be a tablet, could be a smart TV, laptop, whatever. Yeah? And we invite you to build a particular user interface. So, for instance, displaying free elements, or playing with width and height. Also dealing with responsive design. You see, so if you're creating a quiz game for mobile, it should look like that. And if you're dealing with a tablet, it should look differently. So the different types of questions. So this is about the basics. But if I show you something a bit more complicated, just to prove the power of Flex and Grid, so let me show you the second Flex. So here we start talking about aligning stuff horizontally, vertically, yeah, which has been a bit complicated historically speaking. Look, you see how to align stuff to the left, to the right, blah, 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 horizontally, vertically, So you can definitely do many nice stuff using Flex. And finally, let's talk about grid, or let me present you at least the grid exercises. So when talking about grid, it's the same principle, right? So you can display boxes following a given criteria. And let me show you the last question, which is super tricky. Look, you see? So with grid, you can create very complex layouts easily given the complexity. Yeah? So once again, I'm going to leave you playing with the training, and today let me present both techniques. Before going into any details, does anyone know the difference, even though in some cases you can change Flex with Grid and vice versa, to the point that working with CodeFlix, we invite you to use one or the other. So in many different cases, you can combine them, you can mix them, you can exchange them. But there is a big difference. Does anyone know the main difference between Flexbox and Grid? And that's another classic job interview question, by the way. Well, not classic, because this is newer stuff, but it will become a classic job interview within the next months, for sure. So Flexbox works in one direction. In other words, if you want to display many elements in one row, first, second, and third, Flexbox works really well. On the other way around, if you want to display elements in one column, one after the other, Flexbox works really well. Yeah, and grid works really well as well. So whatever Flexbox does, grid does that as well. But grid is a superset. Grid goes beyond the scope of Flex. And the main difference is Flexbox is unidirectional, either horizontally or vertically. But grid is by definition multidimensional. Grid is a grid, X and Y. Yeah? So thanks to grid, you can nest, you can deal with complex structures. Do you remember the example I showed you with the website? The navigation, the sidebar, the footer, the content, the header. Yeah? So whenever you want to build a multi-dimensional bunch of boxes, grid is your friend. If you only want to display elements in a row or elements in a column, you can use either. Yeah? As part of Codery, the Codery platform, I'm using both. But, and this is a personal appreciation, over the last months, I'm getting a big fan of grid. Learning grid is a bit more complicated, but it's more powerful. And there is one aspect of grid, I'll show you later on, that I love it. And because of that single CSS property, I'm getting rid of Flexbox progressively. I'll show you in a minute. All right, so before going into any complexity, let's present the problem. I would like to display, for instance, 3 boxes. Yeah? And then I would like to arrange them following some criteria, depending on my appetite. So I got my, let me zoom that a bit. So can you see the screen, guys? Can you see the screen? Yeah, cool. So what you can see here, this is just a sample project with Create React app, what I created yesterday actually. There's nothing, right? So just hello, CSS, you know, pretty much nothing on it. So I would like to create, as I said, 3 boxes. Regardless of whether you work with Flexbox or with Grid, the pattern, the HTML is the same. Yeah? So we can reuse the same HTML. The difference is on the right-hand side, on the CSS. So let's build the HTML. The pattern is, first of all, you need to create an element surrounding your boxes. You need a parent element, like a div. A div is just a classic element in HTML, right? Like a box. And now, inside of the div, then you got your elements. So let's talk about characters. Boris, Angela, and Vladimir. Yeah? So we got three elements. Could be text, could be images, could be videos, it doesn't matter, right? 3 elements. So by default, like that, without doing any CSS. So if I now look at my resulting HTML, my web browser, how do you think the elements will be displayed? One after the other, as Kaini suggested. All right. Yeah? That's the default behavior of HTML. By default, when you create a div, it spans all the available width in that row. Yeah? That's why you got one after the other. That's the classic way the HTML, the web has been working. But the problem is, what happened? Because I have plenty of space. If I don't want to do that, this is everything in one column. But what happens if I want to change the axis to display everything in one row? So Boris on the left, then Angela, and then Vladimir. This is where Flex is your friend. Here, first of all, if you want to do some CSS, and this has nothing to do with Flexbox or with Grid, whenever you want to do CSS, you need to add some classes. Yeah? That's the way you customize the look and feel of your app. Yeah? So that's the way the CSS works. That has nothing to do with React, nothing to do with Flexbox. This is just HTML and CSS. So, can anyone tell me how do I add a class name or a class to refer to the parent element? Class name, because we're using React, and then we need to give a class name. We can put whatever we want here, characters or people, it doesn't really matter. Yeah? That's just the Technically speaking, if you go to the internet if you check any tutorial about Flexbox, the de facto standard is to call it either container or I think MDN likes to call it wrapper. It doesn't really matter. Yeah? The important thing is to note, I'm going to use container, that this contains your boxes. And now, likewise, let's add some classes to the items. According once again to the standards, the community likes to call these elements item. Yeah? You can also call it box or element. Again, it doesn't really matter. Let me call it item. And let's do the same for the other HTML characters. Yep, something like that. And that's all we need from the HTML point of view. I don't think I'm going to touch the HTML anymore. So that's the setup. That's what you need to do every time you want to lay out your boxes. Let me move things a bit to get some extra space on the screen. And hopefully it will be a bit easier to have a look to the CSS bit. There you go. Yeah? Any questions so far? No? All right. So, the way to display our free frames in a single row is just by, look, going to the CSS. How do you refer to a class in CSS? Dot, correct? You see? So that's the way I can style my parent container. And now, look, display flex. That's it. Just by typing, Camila, are you cold?
Yeah, I'm going to move later on.
Do you have any heater? Do you have, just grab a heater. There are 4 or 5 heaters. Well, just have a look later on, but
I can move after lunch, don't worry.
I'm sure it should be heaters for everybody, right? Anyway. Yeah, check exactly. Check if it's switched on because it's 1, 2, 3. If it's off, yeah. Anyway, all right. So, guys, display flex. Let's see what happened when we go back to our screen. Oh, look. Did it work? Technically speaking, it did work. It satisfied the requirement. The requirement was to display all the elements in one row. We could discuss if the styling is good or not, if we should have some spacing, but technically speaking, all the elements are in the same row. And now let me show you a trick. Imagine that you want to do many sort of try and error testing. For instance, that's typical thing when you want to play with colors. Yeah? Imagine that I want to change the color. Background, color, green. And then you go back to the browser, green, I don't know, let's change it to blue. And then you go back and then it's blue, and then I don't know, red. You know, sometimes you have to really do quick prototyping back and forth. So whenever that happens, let me introduce you something very interesting, which is Google Chrome DevTools. With Chrome, and actually the same with Safari and Firefox or any other browser, you can prototype HTML and CSS very quickly. How do we do that? Look, anywhere in the screen, you do right click, and then you select inspect. And you will get a panel. By default, I think, oh, sorry, I closed it. Let me open it again. By default, that panel shows at the bottom. So I think by default, you'll get something like that. But if you click on the 3 dots, I think I can zoom that a bit. That's maybe too much, right? You see the 3 dots? If you click there, you can snap it to the right. I personally prefer to leave it on the right, but that's up to you. Anyway, once you got that open, now what? Look, now you can inspect your HTML, you see? And then on the left-hand side, it's highlighting the element that I'm selecting. I'm hovering, you see? Why I'm doing that? Because if I select my container, if I click on it, look, I can quickly prototype my changes, you see? So It's very easy, and even with Chrome you get a color picker, so you can do very sexy stuff right here. So this is really good for prototyping, for quick testing. For instance, you can change the color to white. By the way, what happens if I refresh the page? Will these changes on the background and the color persist or not? No. So this is only for testing. So if you like the result, if you like it, then copy that, yeah? Because if I refresh the page, the changes are gone. But that's not a bad thing, because that's a very good way to break your app without consequences. Yeah? You play around, and if you don't like the result, you refresh. But if you did like what you did, then back to your VS Code, you paste it, and then it doesn't matter how many times you refresh, the changes are there already. Yeah? So, why I'm showing you that? Because you can not only change properties, you can disable them. Look at what happened if I untick that. Look. So that's the best way to see the impact of using Flex. You see? No Flex, block base, one after the other. Flex, one near the other, nearby. You see? So I can select the items. So Flex is definitely doing something. But now you may argue, well, that's fine, but that doesn't look really good, right? I really want to have Boris on the left, but then I want to have Angela in the middle, and then I want to have the other one, Vladimir, on the right-hand side. How do we do that? Well, we need to add a new CSS property. Not on the parent, but on the child, on the item. Look, if I type .item, that's a bit mind-blowing, but it will make sense in 5 minutes. If you type now flex1, you are telling the browser that you want to expand its column as much as possible. Let me show you. You see the difference? So now our layout looks much better. You see? Boris, and then Angela, literally in the middle, and finally Vladimir. So what flex1 means? Flex1 means you are setting one virtual column, number one, per item. We got 3 items, so we got 3 virtual columns. Each item will span 1 out of 3, 1/3. That's why it looks like that. Yeah? 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. To visualize that a bit better, let me change, instead of background color, let me set a border. See if that any helps. And let me change the color to white, from white to black. Right, so let me set the border on the item, because I really want to see the border. Here you go, you see? So now I hope, even if it's a bit small, I hope you agree with me that each box spans 1 out of 3 columns in that particular row. Question for you, what happens if I change flex from 1 to 2? Will that make any impact, visually speaking? Why not, Andrea?
I know, yeah, yes. No.
I'm saying no, because they're all 2, so proportionally they're all taking the same amount of space.
So Alex got it. Proportionally, we haven't changed anything. How many virtual columns our container has?
2 per
In total, how many? 6. Correct. 2 plus 2 plus 2. In total, we got 6 virtual columns. But then, each item spans how many virtual columns? 2. So this is 2 out of 6, 2 out of 6, 2 out of 6, which is 1/3. So that's not going to make any impact. Look, that's the same.
It's always 6.
Say it again?
It's always 6.
No. It's 6 columns because I put flex 2. How many virtual columns we have now? 9. And so that depends on the number. So then you may be thinking, all right, so what's the point of doing that, right? I've seen people doing this, flex 100. Why you do that? Nothing really changes, yeah? So the benefit of using flex with a number different to 1 is the ability of, for instance, making one of the columns more prominent. Let me show you an example. Imagine that we want to make the column in the middle larger because that character is more prominent or because of whatever reason. Yeah? We want to make sure that Angela gets a bit more space from Boris and from Vladimir. Yeah? How do we do that? Well, we can add a new class to Angela. Let me call it special or large or important, I don't mind. Yeah? Just add a new text, add a new class. Let me call it large. Yeah? And then what? Well, then I can type dot large. What should I type here? 2, for instance. So now the question is, how many virtual columns do we have? 4, that's correct. Percent-wise. So what percent of the width will Boris span? 25%. Because it's 1 out of 4. And Angela? 50%. And Vladimir?
Can you explain that?
Sorry.
Oh.
Here you go. You see? Now Angela is as large as Boris and Vladimir together. 25%, 50%, 25%. And if you don't trust me, if you hover the element, you probably cannot see anything, but probably you can see on the left-hand side, Google is telling you the exact dimension of the highlighted box. So Boris is 97.7 pixels width. You cannot see that. I cannot zoom that. Vladimir is also 97.7 pixels width. So Angela should be almost 200, right? 198. Here you go, 193.4. It's clearly double size. So Anita, you have a question?
I think it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, go for it. Second. It's recorded and streamed. Hello, YouTube. Yeah, all the workshops are available.
So how do you find it?
youtube.com/Codery. Yep. Any questions? No?
So how is there any maximum size where we
Yeah.
keep adding?
Of course, at some point, you may have problems. What happens if large is 2 million? The browser will do something weird. Let's have a look. So the browser will try to span Angela as much as possible, but eventually there is some restrictions, which is the size of the text on the sides. So that's not really accurate. I hope you agree with me. Angela is not 2 million larger than Boris and Vladimir. So that's why eventually that doesn't make sense. Actually, we can do something. Look, if we go back here, so we can, let me show you, sorry, not the item, I click on the wrong one. I want to select Angela. Here you go. Large. Look, if I change 2, look, this is 1, right? 2, 3, 4, 5. You see, at some point it stops working. But, you know, there's nothing else we can do, right? I didn't mention that, but instead of going up, you can go down. So you can make a column smaller. So if instead of 1, you set the flex to 0, what will happen is the Angela column will be as small as possible. Yeah? What as small as possible means? Well, as small as the text is. That's as small as possible. Yeah? That's in case you want to do something very small. But that's a corner case. Generally speaking, should be 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever. Anyway, what do you think about naming conventions? Is large good CSS class now? No, because at the moment, Flex 0 is shrinking our column. So I wouldn't call it large, that's misleading. So if you really want to do that, then call it, I don't know, small or, you know.
Also, regarding name conventions, I've seen dashes in between some item dash name. Is that good way of writing?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Rochelle. Over the last decades, JavaScript and any programming language has evolved a lot in terms of coding styles, making sure your code is clean, readable, blah, blah, blah. With CSS, that hasn't been the case. So one of the problems many companies have is not with JavaScript, it's with CSS. Eventually, it's hard to orchestrate your CSS. We will run shortly a workshop about specificity to prove how challenging CSS can be. Yeah? Because of that, now there are some approaches towards orchestrating your CSS in a very good way. Let me recommend you a book. So there is a guy that wrote a book. There is an online version, PDF for free, things like that. It's a very short reading. It's like 50 pages. So I completely recommend you to do that. And also, because, don't forget something, once you start looking for a job, you need to do something different. You need to do something different. You are fighting against other developers that have learned JavaScript, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? So you need to do something different. And if you prove that you care about CSS, that you understand the complexity of CSS, and at least you are doing some efforts trying to minimize the impact of CSS in the project, that will give you a big bonus, right? So let me present you a book called SMAX, Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. I really like this book because the guy is very honest. Like, hey, this is not based on any standard. This is based on my experience building CSS. Because I reckon that sometimes it's a nightmare, so let me present you my approach towards dealing with that. Yeah? You may not agree with everything. I don't agree with everything, but you can really feel the guy is really good. And he proposed different naming conventions. Back to Rochelle, back to your question. So, for instance, what he suggests is to do something like that. If you got an item and you have another item, which is a variation of the original item, just do that. Yeah? Use an underscore to reflect that this is an item of type large. But this is not based on any standard. This is based on what this guy recommends in order to improve the readability of your CSS. Yeah? Anything else?
On the inspect, you had
Yep.
flex over 2 numbers. What was,
Here?
yeah.
So you want me to put 200?
No, just what's the second number?
Second. So to be honest, I never use the second number, so I don't even know what it is. But we can figure out. So CSS flex. If you search CSS flex, you are likely to end up on the CSS tricks article, which is really good. It's quite complex, but it's really good because here you see it explains in a very visual way what we explained today. You see the container, the items. Obviously, there are many things we haven't covered today. Things about alignment, stuff like that. But you see, so this is the type of things that we've been talking about. Yeah, flex 1, flex 2. So yeah, I cannot give you an answer, Alex, at the moment.
Okay.
Because essentially, when you use flex, that's a typical thing in CSS. This is a shorthand of multiple flex properties. Yeah. So I think flex is the shorthand of flex row. I'm not 100% convinced about that. But hey, let's try it, right? Let's try it. So let me bring it back. And if that works, Yeah, you see, it still works. So the first value of flex is actually referring to another called flex row. So you can use either one or the other. If you prefer to use flex, because it's just simpler, just bear in mind that Google Chrome will add a second value that you can easily ignore. Yeah. Anything else?
Can you explain that again? So you're saying that when we use flex row,
Yeah, so flex, look, if I'm using, let me give you another example. Background red, it works. But in reality, background is a shorthand of background color, background image, background repeat. It's a shorthand. It's like a simpler way of combining multiple properties together. Or even a simple example. Look, if I do border 1 pixel solid red, let me change the color to 10 pixel solid blue. Yeah, with the border. But in reality, I'm typing 3 instructions. Border width, 10 pixels, border style thing, yeah, and border color. That's the same. So this instruction is equivalent to these 3 instructions. Yeah, same result. But I hope you agree with me that that one is easier because in one line you solve the problem. So the same thing applies to flex. Flex in reality is a shorthand of multiple properties. Some of them go beyond the scope of this session. The one I care about is the first one, which is flex row. So when you do flex 1, that's equivalent to do flex row 1. So you use one or the other. It doesn't really matter. Yeah? Anything else?
Do you have an introduction to CSS on Query?
We have an introduction to CSS. That's a good question. I need to check if we have an introduction to CSS.
No, that's like CSS freaks, pretty much.
CSS what?
That CSS freaks is quite self-explanatory.
Yeah, and anyway,
Not standard as well.
so we'll run many workshops about CSS. So this is one of the aspects.
Before this, background.
Yeah, we can definitely, we can do another workshop about basics of CSS. Yeah, that's fine. Any question about flex? No? All right, so let's now talk about grid. So I would like to solve the same problem using grid, and at the end I'll show you the advantage of using grid against flex. So with grid, I think grid is, sometimes it's even easier. And let me show you why. Let me get rid of the large thingy. I'll show you why grid is easier. Look, I got rid of half of my CSS. I only care about the container. Yeah? Look, the only thing you have to do is display flex, no, display grid. Let's see what happened. Let's see what happened. Doesn't work. It doesn't work because even though now we're displaying the elements as a grid, we have to specify the layout. And how do we do that? We just need a single property called grid template columns. Here is where we specify the layout. Let me solve it, and then you'll tell me what I'm doing. Can anybody tell me what I did here?
Split it in 3 virtual columns.
Correct. I'm explicitly specifying that my container will be one row with how many virtual columns? 3, correct. 1, 1, and 1. Boom. Even easier. Second? FR means fragment. Fragment is just virtual unit. This is something that doesn't exist, yeah? So this is one fragment or one virtual column, one fragment or one virtual column, one fragment or one virtual column. So now my question is, what happens if we want to make Angela again twice as wide as her colleagues?
Having 2 forms?
Two FRs where?
In the middle.
Two FRs? What do you mean? Like that? No?
No, it's two.
Like that?
Yeah.
What do you think? Well, let me add a border. It looks correct, but let me add a border so we can clearly visualize it. Border, 1 pixel, solid, red, not here on the item, right? On each item. Does it make sense? It works. So you can see that we've solved the same problem, ignoring the border, it's easier. We don't even need to add a class to the items. Simplicity, that's the key of grid, at least when talking about this type of exercises. Yeah? Of course, if we talk about more complex exercises, yeah, it's going to be more challenging. But that's about grid, at least the basics of grid. So my suggestion is start playing with it, the sooner the better. And now, let me show you the final property. That is the very single reason why I'm using grid a lot in the last few months. Let me go back to Flex. Let me present you the problem first. Yeah? Back to Flex, blah, blah, blah. Let's see what we got here. Flex 1. Yeah, and then large. That's what I showed you before. Yeah. My question is, how will you add some space between the characters? I want to add some space between Boris and Angela. How do you do that? Margin where? Around the item. All right. Margin. All right. So margin is a way binding to what Fish suggested about talking about the basics of CSS. So with margin, we can add some space surrounding elements. And it works. But that's not what I asked you to do. Because, look, if I select a box, you see, it's adding a margin surrounding top, bottom, left, and right. I didn't want to add margin right here, right, margin right, but then, okay, so it worked on the first, on the second, but it also added a margin on the last. I didn't want to add a margin on Vladimir. You add what?
You add some, create a new class.
A class where? In Vladimir. So what do we do here?
No, you add it to Boris. Another class,
Class Boris? No, because between Boris and Angela is okay. Between Angela and Vladimir is okay as well. I want to have a space between my characters. But I don't want to have a space here. Say it again, Kaine? A class for Angela.
And margin left and right.
Eventually, we will solve the problem. But I hope you agree with me, that's complicated. And I'm not even talking what happens if I add a fourth character. Is it going to be a big mess? Yeah, I know. I know these things. I know we can find it, we can solve it, we can add a special class, margin 0. We can solve it, yeah, of course. But to me, this is exhausting. I don't want to do that.
So with grid, should we just add fractals?
I'll show you. Let me solve it with Flex. So with Flex, I could go to Vladimir, another new class called last, for instance, and then I will do .last, and then I could do margin right 0. Yeah. So now if I refresh, it works exactly as I wanted. But what happened if now I add a fourth character on the right hand side? So let me add a new character here, Donald, and I refresh. I broke it because my last class is assigned to Vladimir. So then I need to come here, and then I have to go there and paste it on the last, and then it works. But if I remove Donald, then I broke it again. So I hope you agree with me that even though, yeah, of course, we can solve it, it's very exhausting. my layout breaks easily. Yeah, that's one of the classic problems of CSS. So now, let me show you how sexy is solving the same problem as using grid. So go back to what I did before, right? Display grid. Look at how simple the code is. It's just amazing. Display grid, and then, do you remember the property to set the columns? Say it again?
Grid template code.
Correct, Anita. Grid. I mean, if you don't remember, you start typing grid template columns, 1 FR, 2 FR, 1 FR, for instance. Yeah? Right. So I'm going to solve the same problem that took us 5 minutes of very intense discussions with one single line of CSS. Boom. Sexiest property in CSS history. It's so obvious that CSS was missing that. Read it up. It's like, hey, easy. Just add a space with my boxes, and that's it, right? One row, just add a space there. And if I add a fourth character, sorry, why? Let me show you something. Why Donald has been promoted to a new line?
Yeah, they have only one, three F1s.
Correct. How many? Yeah? Correct. You see, our layout, how many columns? 1, 2, double size, and 3. Yeah? So that means that if there is a fourth element, it will go to a new line. That's the point about grid. It can easily handle multiple rows. So can I do that? Yeah. There you go. How many virtual columns do we have now? 4 or 5?
5.
It's 5. We've got 5 virtual columns. 1 FR plus 2 FR. We got 3, right? Plus 1 FR, 4, plus 1 FR, 5. Out of 5, that will span 1 out of 5, which is percent 20, right? Back to school. 1 out of 5 is 20%. 20 plus 20 plus 20. So what percent we got here? 40%, yeah? 2 out of 5. But anyway, it doesn't really matter how many elements I have. As far as the number of columns is correct, you see? The space is always in between of the elements.
But you could have done the flex justify actions around
When talking about flex, there are multiple ways of aligning. And so what Kine is suggesting is to use a property called justify content. So do you remember Microsoft Word when you justify your text to the left, to the right? Yeah, you remember that thingy? So that's the same thing. Here, with justify content, you can move stuff to the left, you can move stuff to the right, you can leave the stuff in the middle. And what Kine is suggesting is to use either space between or space around. You are right at some extent. That will definitely add some space. Yeah, for instance, space between, it will move everything to the corners. But that is going to add a random space in between the elements. If that's okay with you, fine. But in my particular case, I didn't want to have a random space. I wanted to have specific 10 pixels. Yeah, that's why it's not the same.
You cannot solve it in flex. There's no way.
Not easily. You can deal with margin right, margin left, but it's a pain in the ass. Yeah? Any questions?
Is there a way to determine height?
The height. So you want to set the height.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, on the item,
Usually by item, it's not like
you do something like that, right?
okay.
And then, there you go. Yeah. Any questions? Right. So again, flex and grid represent a huge wall. We could do a bootcamp only to talk about flex and grid. Yeah.
Why is flex still used when like grid does everything what flex does?
Because flex has some advantages. Flex is simpler, theoretically speaking, because only looks after one dimension. Let me give you an example. As you notice, as soon as I added a fourth character, I broke my layout because you see Donald got moved to a new row, so I had to change it. I had to do something like that. So if you really want to keep your CSS plain without any changes, you know, that particular case may not work well. With Flex, however, you remember what we did before, guys, with Flex. It doesn't really matter how many characters you have. You've got 4, it displays 4. What happens if we add a 5th character? So will Teresa be displayed on the same row or not? Correct. Okay. So the thing is, to me, you cannot only focus on only flex or only grid. At some point, depending on what you are trying to build, you will need one or the other. Yeah, one or the other.
You can use flex inside the grid system.
Yeah, of course. Listen, you can use flex inside of grid, grid inside of flex, flex inside of flex, grid inside of grid. So of course you can go crazy. You can go crazy. My suggestion is start doing training on the platform because you got a bunch of good exercises where you can definitely.
The frog stuff is nice. The frog for learning.
The frog, yeah. You know what Andrea is talking about? There is a frog game, right? Frog game flex, right? The thing.
Maybe top,
See, Flexbox Froggy, a game for learning CSS Flexbox. So yeah, you need to do some obscure stuff with the frog by dealing with CSS, right? That's a popular website. So yeah, definitely feel free to have a look. I think so. Yeah. So there is a grid frog, right? Grid garden. Yeah, so you can play with frogs to deal with flex and with vegetables. It's a vegan game to play with grid. Yeah.
Ricardo, which is better to start with if you move to CSS, Flex or Grid?
I find flex a bit easier because grid can go very complicated. Even though in this particular example, grid sounded a bit easier probably. If you check the docs of grid, I mean, easy, right? Let me go to CSS grid, CSS tricks, grid. I mean, it's just insane how many things you can do with grid. So to me, it is a bit overwhelming. Look at the scroll bar. So that can get very, very serious, right? So I find it a bit.
Depends what you want to create. If it's just a block where like you have some buttons on top and lists where you write content, flex will work.
Yeah.
If you want to do something more, complicated.
Yeah, I agree on that, Octavian. To me, there is no perfect answer. It depends on the scenario. When I build part of a piece of UI, generally speaking, I don't have a clear idea if one will work better than the other. I try, and if I feel this is getting overcomplicated, maybe I try with the other, and eventually I decide. They have pros and cons. Yeah. Anything else? No. All right. So I would like to do something